In August 1945, the Texas summer didn't simply warm the air, its heat settled like a crushing weight, baking the dust roads and bleaching the sky into a blinding sheet of white fire. A military truck ground to a halt beside a barbed wire fence in the middle of nowhere. Inside sat 6 German women in faded olive uniforms, their faces drawn with fear and exhaustion. They had been warned their whole lives that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture, humiliation, and likely death. Followers of Hitler, even if they were not soldiers, were promised no mercy. They had worn the uniform, touched the war, and now they were prisoners of it. 22-year-old Ilse Köhler sat stiffly on the wooden bench, remembering childhood images of starving German children blamed on Versailles and the school parades she once marched in under swastika banners. Her teachers had told her Americans were beast-greedy, wild, dangerous. She braced for the worst, being stripped, searched, maybe beaten. But when she stepped down from the truck and onto American soil, the first thing she saw wasn't a rifle. It was a young American soldier, barely older than she was, holding out a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. As the cap hissed off, he offered it with a smile. "Welcome to Texas, ma'am." And in that blistering Texas heat, everything she had been taught about her enemies began to collapse. She had come expecting a prison. She had no idea she was about to discover a new life. German female POWs in America were rare, and before understanding how a young woman in a Nazi uniform could one day fall in love with a Texas cowboy, it's necessary to understand how she ended up in Texas at all. By war's end, the United States held over 450,000 German prisoners scattered across nearly 500 camps stretching through the South, Midwest, and West. Texas alone housed more than 78,000. Most were men soldiers of the Wehrmacht or sailors of the Kriegsmarine. But a small and often forgotten group, likely fewer than 1,000, were women. They were not frontline fighters, but they were official auxiliaries or support staff, nurses, clerks, secretaries, or civilian volunteers who had followed the military. Some believed deeply that they were fulfilling their patriotic duty. They were captured across Europe, France, Italy, Germany itself, then processed under the Geneva Conventions and shipped across the Atlantic, often without knowing their destination. The journey was long and terrifying, but what frightened them most was what they expected to find in America. From childhood, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as savage, immoral, and racially corrupted, a nation of mongrels, criminals, and soulless enemies. For women like Ilse, the fear wasn't just imprisonment, but humiliation and assault. These were not irrational fears. They had been drilled into them for years, yet nothing they found in Texas resembled what they had been told. American POW camps, especially in Texas, were unlike anything in Europe or the Pacific. The U.S. was required by international law to provide humane conditions, but many American commanders went beyond the minimum. In rural areas, prisoners were even encouraged to interact with local communities because POW labor filled gaps caused by the draft. Women, like the men, were allowed to leave the camps for farm work. Sometimes guards accompanied them. Sometimes they were trusted to return on their own. This trust stunned the Germans. Inside the camps, they received beds with mattresses, libraries, Red Cross parcels with cigarettes and chocolate, and even musical instruments, theater activities, and English lessons. Guards didn't strike them. They followed protocol and addressed prisoners respectfully. One former POW later admitted, "I had never eaten so well in my life as I did in an American camp." For women raised under strict Nazi doctrine, the psychological shock was overwhelming. The supposed monsters fed them, treated them politely, and offered more dignity than many of their own officers had. Ilse Köhler had grown up near Dresden, shaped by propaganda long before she could understand it. Her teachers wore brown shirts. Her textbooks began with Germany's humiliation after World War I, and every lesson insisted the nation had been betrayed by outside enemies, with America among the worst. By 10, she could recite Hitler's speeches by memory. At 15, her family hosted a soldier on leave who told stories of American bombers destroying cities and Americans treating prisoners like vermin. She believed every word. At 18, she volunteered as a typist for a Luftwaffe medical unit, never armed, but still in uniform. When captured outside Munich in April 1945, she expected punishment, not processing. But instead of cruelty, Americans handed her water, a blanket, and later a toothbrush, soap, and a clean pair of shoes. It wasn't mercy, it was regulation. U.S. military rules demanded humane treatment, adequate food, medical care, male privileges, and regular inspections. For Ilse, none of this made sense. The enemy she feared treated her more gently than the regime she had served. The propaganda she had grown up with had been too effective. Her emotional world had been built on fear of Americans, fear of dishonor, fear of Germany losing the war. Now that the war was over, she waited for the horrors she had been promised. But instead, she found clean sheets, privacy, books, and soda bottles instead of brutality. Every small kindness only deepened her confusion. The Americans didn't demand political loyalty. They didn't lecture about democracy. They simply treated her with basic decency. One June morning, Ilse was assigned to work on a cotton farm 20 miles from the camp. It was her first time beyond the wire since arriving. She rode in the back of a pickup with 4 other prisoners and 1 guard, whose main job was ensuring no one wandered off, not that anyone had a place to run. Waiting for them was Thomas Walker, a tall, sunburned 25-year-old Navy veteran whose family farm had lost all its workers to the war. He had never met a German woman before, especially one who seemed pulled straight from a propaganda poster, tall, pale, blonde, and wary. Neither trusted the other, and they shared no common language. But as the day stretched under the Texas sun, something subtle shifted. Thomas brought water. Ilse helped sort cotton. He showed her how to use gloves to avoid blisters. She said, "Thank you," in English. He replied, "Jern," in German. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet, but it was human. And for 2 people, raised worlds apart, taught since childhood to hate one another, that small humanity was more radical than either imagined. The Texas sun made everything harder, the tasks, the air, even the quiet, but the atmosphere was something Ilse hadn't felt in what seemed like a lifetime. It was peaceful. There were no air raid sirens, no harsh orders, no walls covered in propaganda. Instead, there were long rows of cotton stretching toward the horizon, a rusted barn, radio humming soft country music, and the steady rhythm of farm work. At first, she kept to herself, but Thomas kept finding small ways to break through her guarded silence. He learned how to pronounce her name properly, Ilse, not Ilse. He brought her a pair of worn leather gloves to protect her hands. Another day, he offered her a handkerchief when her palms blistered. Once he shyly handed her a lemon drop from his pocket. None of it was required, and none of it hinted at romance, at least not yet. But for a young woman raised in a world where kindness was rationed and suspicion was routine, these gestures felt quietly revolutionary. Bit by bit, Ilse began to laugh again, small, hesitant laughs at first, as though unsure if she was allowed to feel anything light. She taught Thomas simple German words. He called her Fräulein, mispronounced, but enthusiastic. She taught him Guten Morgen, while he taught her the unfamiliar drawl of howdy. Both struggled, and both laughed at each other's attempts. One afternoon during a break, Thomas handed her a small notebook and pencil. For English, he explained awkwardly, pointing between them. And so the two began writing notes back and forth, halting sentences at first. "The sky is blue. You are funny. I like music. Do you miss home?" Writing felt safer. It offered time to think, to translate, to hope the other would understand. Ilse wrote that she had 2 brothers, one dead in Russia, the other missing. She didn't know if her parents were alive. Thomas wrote that he'd lost his older brother in Normandy, and that his mother cried every Sunday in church. He confessed he wasn't sure why he survived when so many hadn't. They avoided politics entirely. No Hitler, no Roosevelt, no arguments about right and wrong. Instead, they wrote about rain, music, horses, and how delicious cold watermelon tasted after a long, blistering day in the fields. It didn't go unnoticed. Prisoners were not supposed to fraternize with civilians, and the rules were strict, especially regarding anything that might resemble affection. Though Thomas and Ilse behaved properly in public, Some locals noticed the way their goodbyes lasted a little too long, or how their glances lingered. One evening, the camp commandant summoned Ilse to his office. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply reminded her, "You are still a prisoner of war. You carry Germany's image. Do not forget who you are." She nodded dutifully, but that night, she cried into her pillow, suddenly unsure of her identity at all. Thomas was warned too. A neighbor told him, "Don't go getting sweet on one of those Nazi girls. People will talk." But Thomas hardly listened. He wasn't in love, not yet, but he was undeniably drawn to her. Something about her quiet strength, her careful words, her attempt to learn, made him see her differently. Her past didn't matter to him. He saw who she was now, kind, curious, and just as lost as he felt. By September, a pattern had formed. Thomas would slip her a note folded into the corner of a book. He returned through a sympathetic guard. She sent back pressed flowers or short English sentences, each one written in careful, slanted handwriting. Then one day, she was gone. The work truck arrived without her. Thomas tried to sound casual when he asked the guard what happened. "Her group's reassigned," the guard replied. "New rotation. New camp next week." That night, Thomas wrote her a long letter, awkward, messy, full of mistakes. At the end, he wrote one question: "If you leave, would you ever come back?" Ilse received the letter 2 days later. She didn't answer right away. She read it once, twice, 3 times, then tucked it deep into her pillow lining where no one would find it. Something had shifted quietly but unmistakably for both of them, and they both knew it. 2 weeks later, when Ilse stepped out of the work truck again at the Walker farm, she carried nothing but a letter in her hand. She had begged the camp officer to assign her to this work detail again, not formally, of course, but she made sure her name appeared on the list when the Walker family requested help. Thomas was waiting by the gate. He didn't smile, and neither did she. Instead, she handed him the folded, trembling letter. He opened it right there in the dust and heat. Inside was her answer: "If I come back, it is not because I am allowed. It is because I choose to. You asked if I would ever return. This is my answer." They worked in silence that day, but something unmistakable had changed. It was no longer a harmless friendship. It was no longer an accident. A choice had been made by both of them, but the choice was dangerous. They were still separated by language, uniforms, war, and law. Relationships between civilians and POWs were forbidden. Ilse could be transferred or punished. Thomas could lose his reputation, or worse, in a country still boiling with fresh anger toward Germany. And yet, across America, quiet connections like theirs were becoming more common. Prisoners and locals bonded over work, music, letters, and shared grief. Few were romantic, fewer survived, but the ones that did glowed fiercely. In secret, Thomas and Ilse found ways to steal small pieces of time together. They worked side by side when they could, shared lunches behind the barn, and hid notes inside hollow fence posts or tucked between book pages. Sometimes she hummed a folk melody from her grandmother. Thomas pretended not to know it, just to keep her singing. One day, he gave her a small pencil sketch he'd drawn of the cotton fields under sunset, clumsy but heartfelt. In the corner he'd written, "For the girl who changed everything I thought I knew." Ilse didn't cry. She folded it carefully and whispered, "Dank," yet fear remained. The war was over, but peace was full of uncertainty. Ilse didn't know whether her home still existed. Letters from Europe took months. Rumors said Germany was starving, that Soviet troops were brutal in the East, and that women who surrendered to the Allies were being shamed or imprisoned by their own countrymen. Going home no longer felt like returning, it felt like vanishing. Thomas sensed all of this, even without her saying it, and so one afternoon in late October, he finally asked the question that had hovered between them for weeks: "What if you stayed?" Ilse looked at him, dirt on her hands and sweat on her brow, and said quietly, "I am a prisoner. I do not get to choose." But Thomas wasn't asking about rules, he was asking about her heart. Within a week, he visited a local pastor to ask what it would take to marry a foreign national. The pastor shook his head. "Not possible while she's a POW," he said. "Even after that'll take government permission. And that won't come easy." but Thomas refused to give up. He wrote to his congressman, to the military, even to the Red Cross. Meanwhile, Ilse quietly applied for transfer to a different camp, one closer to the offices processing repatriation. She told no one, not even Thomas. She couldn't promise what she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to keep. Then in December, the notice arrived. All German POWs would begin mandatory repatriation steps in early 1946. Medical checks, documentation, and preparations for deportation. Most would be gone within 3 months. Ilse read the notice alone in her bunk, the words blurring as her world shifted again. Ilse knew she had less than 100 days left in America, and the weight of that reality settled heavily in her eyes. That same night, Thomas met her at the far edge of the Walker property, in the narrow stretch of land that sat just outside the range of the camp patrols. "I got your drawing," she whispered, her voice barely rising above the wind. "I keep it in my pillow." Thomas reached for her hand with the same cautious gentleness he always carried around her, as though afraid the moment might shatter. "I don't want to lose you," he told her. "I don't care where you came from. I just want you here." She didn't answer at first, letting the quiet hold them both. When she finally spoke, she asked, "Do you know what they'll say about you?" But Thomas only nodded, unconcerned. "Let them talk," he said, and nothing could have sounded more American. With the war winding down, the world was splitting into endings and beginnings, and by January 1946, the war was over, not only on paper, but in spirit. American soldiers were returning home. Factories were converting from tanks to toasters. Parades filled the streets. Weddings crowded the churches, and newborns were being named after generals. Yet for Ilse Köhler, nothing settled inside her. She existed in a strange limbo, no longer a prisoner, not yet a citizen, neither confined nor free. Her German uniform had been taken away, replaced with plain work clothes, and her days were filled with labor, English lessons, and waiting. The US government had begun repatriating German POWs by the tens of thousands, first the men, then civilians, then women. Ilse's turn approached quickly. A formal notice arrived. She was to report to Camp Herne for transport within 4 weeks, her destination listed as Bremerhaven, Germany. The paper gave no answers about her parents, her home, or her future, and it offered nothing about Thomas. When she told him, his jaw tightened, but he didn't rage or argue. He simply nodded and said, "Then we need to make this official." He had studied the law and found a narrow opening, the War Brides Act of 1945, which allowed foreign women who married American servicemen during the war to immigrate legally, even if they had once belonged to an enemy nation. Ilse wasn't married, and Thomas was no longer on active duty, but rare precedents existed. Some marriages between POWs and Americans had already slipped through the system. Controversial, yes, but not impossible. Thomas contacted a helpful lawyer in Dallas, wrote letters, made phone calls, and gathered testimony from neighbors who knew Ilse only as a quiet, hardworking young woman, never as a Nazi. Meanwhile, Ilse was transferred to Camp Herne, a sprawling and chaotic final stop before deportation. Some prisoners waited desperately to return home, while others feared the hunger, arrests, and devastation that awaited them. One heartbreaking letter reached Ilse from home. Her mother had died in an air raid, her father's whereabouts were unknown, and her missing brother had never returned. Her entire world now existed in Texas, in a cotton field, in a guarded smile, in a man who carried her first note tucked inside his wallet. Thomas visited the camp using a civilian work permit. They met through a chain-link fence and were granted 10 minutes. "Will you marry me?" he asked again, softer this time. "I don't know if they'll let us," she replied. "I don't care," he said. "I'll wait. I'll find a way." She lowered her gaze, then raised it with trembling eyes. "Then yes," she said. "Yes." But the bureaucracy moved painfully slow. Every department demanded proof and explanation. By February, her departure was moved up to March 1 Street. They were running out of time. Just days before she was to be shipped out, a telegram arrived from the regional provost marshal. A marriage license for Ilse Köhler and Thomas Walker had been approved, pending in-person registration. It was a slim chance, but enough. Under guard, Ilse was escorted to a courthouse in Waco, where Thomas waited in his best shirt and a borrowed tie. She wore a plain white dress lent by a pastor's daughter. There were no flowers, no music, just a weary judge, two witnesses, and two soft "I do's." That afternoon, Ilse's legal status changed. Not yet fully American, but no longer deportable. Her removal was halted pending immigration review. She did not return to Germany. She returned to Amarillo. People talked, of course. Some whispered when she walked by. But Thomas stood with her, and his family supported her, and slowly the town softened. Some never accepted her, but others admired her gentleness and dignity. She learned to bake cornbread, planted sunflowers behind the barn, and began working at the local library, teaching German to returning veterans who wanted to understand the language of the people they had fought. When asked where she came from, she always said the same thing: "Germany sent me here, but America made me stay." Their first marriage had been legal but quiet, and Ilse longed for something that felt like a true beginning. In spring 1946, Thomas's mother gave her a gift: her own wedding veil wrapped in lavender paper, kept since 1919. Ilse wore it for a second ceremony at a small chapel, this time with music, flowers, and a borrowed dress. And this time, she spoke her vows in English. She chose America, but she never erased Germany. For years, she wrote letters and sent care packages, canned peaches, aspirin, photographs to anyone still living back home. Many letters never arrived. Some came back unopened. Eventually, she stopped writing. She never returned to Germany, not for visits, funerals, or even after the Berlin Wall fell. When asked why, she would say only that life ended. This one began. She and Thomas lived through droughts, recessions, the Cold War, the moon landing, and the rise of television. They never had children, a quiet sorrow. They rarely mentioned, but they had nieces, nephews, a community, and each other. At the local library, Ilse became known as the German lady who remembers everything. She taught teenagers how to pronounce Guten Abend, cook Spitzel for the county fair, and stood with Thomas every Veterans Day. Sometimes, especially in autumn, she would sit on the porch sketching the memories she tried to hold before they faded. One drawing, still kept by a distant relative, showed a cotton field at sunset. In the corner, in her careful, slanted handwriting, were the words, "Everything I thought I knew." Thomas died in 1993, and Ilse followed in 2007. They were buried side by side in a small Texas cemetery, their headstone reading, "Together through war and peace." Her story was never printed in textbooks or told in documentaries, but it was one of many quiet, nearly forgotten stories. After the war, at least 37 marriages took place between German POWs and American citizens, some men, some women, all of them people whose lives defied the simple narratives of war. Ilse's story reminds us that even between enemies, understanding can grow. Even among strangers, mercy can bloom. What Nazi propaganda never imagined was that young Germans, raised in its shadow, would fall in love with the very people they had been taught to hate, and that those Americans would love them in return. It wasn't betrayal, it was humanity reclaimed. Ilse didn't stop being German, but she became American in the truest sense, not by birth, but by belief. She believed in work, dignity, forgiveness, and second chances. Those beliefs didn't come from slogans, but from a Texan cotton field and a young man who offered her a soda instead of suspicion. When she died, the local newspaper wrote a modest obituary: Ilse Walker, German-born, Texas resident, beloved wife, librarian, and friend to all. It mentioned nothing of the war, but her niece remembered the last question Ilse ever answered. Someone asked if she regretted leaving Germany. She paused a long moment and finally said, "Germany gave me fear. America gave me a future. I chose the future."